The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the excuse me. Hello and welcome to the EuroSTAR December webinar series. Today's presenter is Bart Vrenegoor, and he will be presenting how to solve testing problems without solving them from his presentation at the EuroSTAR Conference 2013 in Gothenburg. If you have any questions for Bart, please type them into the questions field on your control panel, and I will address these questions to Bart directly at the end of the webinar. You can type your questions at any point during the course of the webinar. The webinar slides, as well as a recording of the webinar, will be available on the EuroSTAR website shortly after the webinar ends. And you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ESComps. You can connect with EuroSTAR conferences by using the Twitter handle @ESComps, and you can also connect with Bart by using the Twitter handle @BartVrenegoor. So I'll now hand you over to today's presenter, Bart. Hello, Bart.
Hello. Well, thank you for the nice introduction. Let my screen and show the presentation before I start. Let's see. You should see my slide deck right now. Once again, thank you for the introduction. My name is Bart Vrenegoor. I'm from the Netherlands. I work for a company called Society, not a very unknown player in the testing market. I started there 8 years ago, straight out of university, as a test engineer, became a test coordinator, became a test manager, and I've been doing projects around testing and test management ever since. Besides that, I'm also part of the R&D department in our testing division, and basically what I do as part of that role is monitor innovations around testing, write on those innovations, talk about those innovations, for example on topics of testing around business intelligence, model-based testing, service virtualization, etc. But today's presentation is not about one of those topics. It's about something completely different. It's about a topic that we, as testers, but also as human beings, try to avoid. It's about problems, and let's be honest, we don't like problems. We try to avoid them, not talk about it, etc., etc. Well, in this presentation, you will see that problems are not that bad at all. And I will tell you in this presentation that, for examples, I believe that problems do not even exist. Well, now, some people will obviously say, well, problems do not exist indeed, because problems are actually opportunities. Well, in my opinion, opportunities don't exist as well. So problems don't exist, and opportunities do not exist as well. I will also tell you that once I've explained to you what I believe problems are, and adopting that view, you can solve your problems without really solving them. And I will show you some examples of outside of our own practice, but also of 3 examples on how to apply this view in testing. And then I will finish this webinar by doing some suggestions on how you could apply this yourself. Just to begin with, I don't think I will give you a front-to-end roadmap on how to solve problems. This is just this presentation is more or less the result of me reading a book on problems, and I will mention the name of the book in the end of the webinar. And what I've learned from that book, I've applied on my own profession, the test profession, and I got a few examples out of there. I will not be able to give you an answer on how to solve all your problems, but I will mention a few. But first, what I'd like to do is I would like to go a little back in time and well, back in time, I think 4.5 to 5 years ago. At that time, I was working at a large bank that was at that time merging with another bank, and I was a test coordinator at a delivery department that delivered software as part of that migration. And at this time, I was a test coordinator, and I ran into what I believe a lot of problems. Just to mention a few examples, when I was working there, I did what every test coordinator did. I wrote a test plan. I had a small team, and people were preparing test cases, were preparing test execution. But during creating those test cases, during that preparation, I already found out that documentation often, very often, lacked the quality that we needed to do proper work, to prepare proper test cases. And then when we finished our preparation and we were all set to go for test execution, we often found that software delivery lacked quality, or they delivered the software too late, and it was our problem, because when software got delivered too late, very commonly and very regularly, people told me, hey, deadline is till deadline. But now instead of 4 weeks of testing, you have 3 or you have 2. And if you want to solve that, go at work in the weekends, go ahead and do some overtime or hire some extra testers. But it's your problem, and we want everything tested by the deadline. So the thing was, this happened release after release after release, and it kind of frustrated me that, every time I ran into these problems and I was somehow not really capable of solving them. Because the way I solved them was the way I learned. What I did was, the moment I ran into problems, I identified that problem. I made it visible. I made it specific what the impact of that problem was for my work. And I communicated that to the rest of the world, my stakeholders, and said, hey, if you deliver too late, we can do a few things. We can hire extra testers. We can move the deadline. We can test less. But every time they told me, hey, everything tested, same deadline. And I ran into the same issues with the lack of documentation, the availability of test environments, etc., etc. All these typical and common problems that test professionals run into. Because what I've learned is, now 5 to 6 years later, what I've learned is when I talk to my colleagues, when I look at my own profession, these problems that I had back then still exist. And really nothing changed. Documentation still lacks quality. People still deliver too late. Test environments are still, down a lot of time or unavailable a lot of times. So somehow, these problems that I've been running into back then and still run into now, and all my colleagues, they seem to be part of our work, what we do. The fun thing is that the way we tried to solve these problems somehow didn't change. We still tried to solve our problems in the same way as we did, or as I did 5 to 6 years ago, and as was described in some books almost 20 years ago. And I think it's time to change, our perception and on problems and the way we try to solve them. Because what I think is the problem with the way we look at our problems is that we kind of focus on the wrong thing. What we usually do is what I just described on my first slide when I was going back in time. When we run into problems, we we look at that problem, we identify it, we define the impact on our work, on us as testers, and we communicate the impact of that problem to the rest of the stakeholders. And I have a few problems with that. I really don't like it because I think it's kind of reactive. It's not solving the problems on the long term, but it's also, kind of putting us testers in isolation. We look at problems from a testing perspective, but we don't take other stakeholders or other people into consideration. For example, to go back to my own example, is when I was working at that bank, that financial institution, I ran into the same issues time after time after time, and I once got really frustrated. People said, hey Bart, you're the new kid here. Things have been going on like this for years and years. So apparently what I thought was a problem was just a regular way of working for a lot of people in that department, and I was the only one considered it to be a problem. So taking that into account, it's not proactive, it's kind of reactive, puts us in isolation, does not really solve our problems. I think it's time to look at our problems in a different way so that we can solve them in another way. But it's interesting to see what a problem really is. And I really like this quote of Stephen Covey. Poor man died this year, by the way. It's such a shame because he provided a lot of insight for me and other people. And what I really like is this quote: the way we see the problem is the problem. Because it says something about that, a problem is not always a problem. Perception is part of that process as well. And I will give you an example that will show you the difference between a problem and a perception and a fact. Let's say, for example, that at your home you have a toilet, and I hope you do. Let's say you have a toilet and it's broken. What are you going to do? You have a problem. And in order to solve that problem, you need to call a plumber. And that plumber will come and fix your problem. But for you, it's a problem. But that same plumber, just has a problem the moment no toilets are broken anymore. So your broken toilet is a problem for you, but for that plumber, it's work. Same toilet, different perspective from two different people defines if it's either work, so a nice thing, or a problem, not a very nice thing. So there's a kind of difference in the way we can look at specific things, facts, things that happen, that make it if it's a problem or not. And I always say problems do not exist, and hey, opportunities do not exist either. It's just facts and the way we look at those things, the facts, the way we interpret them. So if you run into a problem, there are basically three ways you can, deal with it. It's the yes and attitude, it's the no because attitude, and it's the yes but attitude. And I will explain them all three very briefly. The yes and attitude, it kind of makes me think of marketing and salespeople. Whatever happens, it will say, hey, the past is the past. Let's get over it. So how can we use this? Let's move on. And, these people try to, accept the problem and move ahead. The no because people, they say, nah, problem is the problem and it should fix itself. I simply do not accept the situation as it is. that toilets should fix itself, for example. And then there's the last category, and it's the yes but way of thinking at problems. And the yes but way of thinking is characterized by doubt. People that are in the yes but category are, how should I say it, they're critical thinkers. They do not believe things at first sight. They need proof. And sometimes they need to reproduce a problem in order to believe the problem. So when I was first introduced with these three categories, I thought, okay, in which category are test professionals? And it's obviously that last category, the yes but category. And that can be a serious problem. Now, in my EuroSTAR presentation, I had a short video that illustrated this way of thinking. And as I do not have the opportunity to provide you with a video, I will explain a situation that more or less describes the video. Let's say that you're on an escalator and you're going up, and halfway it stops working. It freezes. You can do you can do multiple things. You can say, hey, apparently it stopped working. What should I do? Let's go ahead and walk. You can do that. You can also say, no, this escalator, man, it should be working. I simply do not accept this thing not to work. I will wait here until it works. But the guy in the video, what he did, he said, what happened? It's not working. Oh my God, it's not working. But I need to get to an appointment. What should I do now? And he was all in doubt because apparently something happened that he didn't expect to happen. And he couldn't solve it. So he stood there waiting until some guy came to fix the escalator. And I think in testing, we are sometimes as this man on this escalator, because the way we solve our problems is not like, hey, let's go ahead. It's not like, no, I do not accept it. It's like, something happened and let's get somebody to fix it. Test environment management, functional designers that fix our documentation, etc., etc. Now what I do is I kind of position this in a very negative and down way. What I do here on purpose is that I position testers as being reactive and not very positive. But you should be thinking, is being a yes but person, is that a negative thing? And I don't think it's a wrong thing, because if you look at society, a whole lot of people get paid to have an attitude like that. Lawyers, judges, doctors, police, controllers, financial people, they all should be critical thinkers. They all should, not believe things at first sight. They all need proof. So being a yes but person is definitely not a negative thing. But I think there's a big difference between being a yes but person as a tester. While sometimes it is expected from us that we show the other two categories as well as being professionals, being members of a team, being colleagues of people. So there's nothing wrong with it, but don't forget that you should be flexible in when you use one of the three categories. So what I've been talking to you about is, first, problems do not exist. Perceptions exist. And if you run into what you think is a problem, there are three ways of dealing with it. Now, take taking this into account, I would like to explain to you how it is possible to solve your problems without actually solving them. And I will do this by giving 2 examples of outside of our practice and 3 examples from within our practice, our test profession. First one is parks, city parks, large parks. There was a company that built these types of parks, and they ran into a problem. What they did is when a large city came to them and said, hey, I want you to build a city park, what they did is they designed it, they built it, and then they started to maintain it. But what they found out is after 2 years, when they walked in the park that they designed and developed and put there, they noticed that on some places people consistently walked on the grass, so the grass would die there. And you know these type of situations, we call them elephant trails or fox trails, where kind of new paths emerge in the grass. So what this company could have done was that they put signs on the grass that said, no walking on the grass because you'll kill it. Do not walk on the grass. If that wouldn't work, they could build small fences so people couldn't walk on the grass because they had to climb over a fence. And if that didn't work, they could probably hire guards with dogs to chase people off the grass. But they did it in a different way. What they did is they when designing a park and building a park there, what they did is they would design it with very little paved paths, very little. And after 2 years, they came back, and when they had to do some maintenance, and they would look, okay, where are people walking? Where is the grass dying? And what they do then is that they would make new paved paths over the dying grass. Because apparently, where the grass was dying, it was where people prefer to walk. The difference, between putting up signs and chasing people off the grass and this way of working is that in the old situation, people walking on the grass was a problem. But in the new way of thinking, it's part of their solution. It's their way of working. So actually in this new situation, it is intended that people walk on the grass. Next example, taxis, London. If you want to be a taxi driver in London, at least before the time of navigation systems, etc., you had to pass an exam. And basically what you had to do before passing that exam is knowing the entire city, knowing the street names, knowing the quarters, know how to get from A to B, using the most efficient route, that type of stuff. And it was pretty hard to get through that exam, to pass that exam. You had to learn for it, and you had to practice it. It was a tough job. Now, at a certain point in time, the amount of taxi drivers or people that wanted to be a taxi driver declined. And a lot of immigrants wanted to be taxi drivers, but they were not familiar with the city, so they couldn't pass the exam. Now, how they could have solved this problem is, put these people on an extensive training course, learn these people a lot more English, put some special cabs in very small neighborhoods, so you only had to learn, a small part of the city. But they didn't do it that way. What they did is that they introduced a new kind of cab, one that an immigrant was driving, and you had to point out how this guy should drive. So you had to give him directions on how to drive. And in return for that, you actually paid a lower fare. So if you were familiar with the city, you could take a cheaper cab, and the only thing you had to do was point out to the guy how to drive. Again, what you see is that in this situation, the initial problem immigrants not, able to pass for the exam was solved in a way where it was actually part of the solution. Immigrants in this way were not even intended to speak the language, which were not even intended to know the city, because if they would have, they could drive a regular cab. Again, it's part of making your original problem part of your solution. Now, how do you apply this in testing? Again, I cannot give you ways of doing this for every problem that you run into, but I'll name 3. The first one, testing without a test environment. I had a colleague that was working at Capgemini, our sister company, and what he ran into a situation. It was a hilarious situation. He was, test manager on a project, and he did what every, test manager does very obviously and very commonly. He created a test plan. He said, okay, this is what I want to test, this is the amount of people I think I need, this is the timelines, this is the amount of money I need, and he said, I need some test environments to do my testing on. And while reviewing, they told him, hey, but there's no money for a test environment. And I thought, the first time I heard this, I thought, yeah, no money for a test environment? How are you going to test if there's no test environment? And to be honest, I don't think I want to be in his shoes in that type of situation. But what he did, and I think it's very hilarious, he said, okay, apparently I cannot do dynamic explicit testing as we usually do, but what can I do? So we started to focus really on doing inspections and reviewing. A lot of inspections and reviewing, not only on individual documents, but also, for example, paper chain testing. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's where you kind of simulate an end-to-end test on paper. He made agreements with external suppliers on the quality that they would deliver, how they would, test that quality on paper, how external suppliers would do demos in order to prove that the software actually had a specific amount of quality. And in the end, going through all these stages, finally they got a pre-production environment to do some testing on, and they could stick with, I think what was needed was only like no more than 10% of the testing that they initially thought they had to do. So while focusing on all these other things, finally 10% of explicit testing, dynamically explicit testing, was enough to get this new software into production. And we often think that not having a test environment could be an issue, but if you use this approach, obviously you don't need a test environment. You don't need a test, an acceptance environment, an integration environment. Apparently a pre-production environment is just enough. So apparently, in this way of working, having your original problem while focusing on other things, you don't even need a test environment. It's going to be part of your solution. The second example I would like to give you is from my own practice. Testing without proper documentation. I think we've all been there. I think 2 to 3 years ago, I was working as a test coordinator at a telco, and release after release, we got documentation to prepare our test cases with. That documentation seriously lacked quality. And we did what every tester would have done in that situation. We tried to solve it with regular reviewing. Let's see. It says my connection to the audio had, and that connection is now restored. Is it working? I'll just continue. In that situation, I found out that a lot of times We tried to do some regular reviewing. We tried to solve it in a regular way, and it wasn't working because we provided our review comments to designers, analysts, and they would simply say, hey, we do not have time for solving your comments because we are already working on the next release, or there's some stuff going on in production that we need to solve. This was really frustrating because if you looked at the tests that we did, they weren't really detailed. They were not really good, and that was really frustrating for us because especially when something went wrong, people came to us and said, hey, why isn't this tested? It was frustrating. So what we did, instead of traditional reviewing, we started to create forms of documentation ourselves. And what we did is we used some sort of model-based reviewing. What we did is we took the documentation that was there and we started to create activity diagrams out of it, process flows. And wherever we ran into a situation where we couldn't understand it, we kind of question marked it, red question mark in the model, and said, okay, wrote a review comment behind it. And then we took that model that we made, we took it to the analysts and the designers, and we said, hey, we created this model, but somehow we're still not really getting it, and we have some questions. And, analysts and designers, they love models, so they say, okay, come over here, let's talk it through. And it was really funny to see that testers and designers were within 15 minutes discussing that model and really going through it and discussing the question marks that we put in there. And in the end, what we noticed is they kind of redraw the model. There was a completely different and extensive, bigger model made out of that discussion, came out of that discussion. And the only thing a tester actually had to say was, hey, I created a model based on your documentation. We kind of restructured this model. It looks completely different now. Where are all these changes in the documentation that you provided me with in the first place? And what we found out was that in next releases, people, analysts, designers, they would adopt the model into their documentation and work towards better documentation that we could really use. And applying this thing called model-based reviewing, it learned us that, traditionally having no documentation is a problem. But when applying model-based reviewing, you really need documentation that lacks quality in order to get to documentation that is even better than regular documentation is in the first place, a lot of times. So this is just another thing. You can only do this when you do not have good documentation. The third example I want to provide you with is, testing with difficult testers. And I got this one from a friend who used to work as a tester as well. And he described a situation where he was in a team of testers, and one tester was one of his colleagues. He was a brilliant guy, truly brilliant guy. This guy was so smart. It was almost scary, This guy could take 10 response times from a system, 2 digits behind the comma, and calculate the average in his head within seconds. That type of smart. This guy was really smart. The only problem was that the communication skills of this guy were not that good. He had a lot of time, he had real difficulty in communicating with his fellow testers, but also with his direct manager, with end users, with developers, etc., etc. And that was an issue. Now, what they could have done was that, they could simply have replaced this guy, but they found out that this guy had a form of autism, Asperger, it's called. And so they found out, okay, apparently we don't give this guy the environment and the work that he needs, to excel, to really get the best out of him. So what they did is they placed him, and this sounds kind of negative, but I do not mean it that way. They kind of isolated him and they gave him a lot of repetitive tasks, regression tests, manual regression tests, and this guy loved it because he could, do the same, more or less the same work day in, day out, and he really loved it. And what I learned is that, for example, in the Netherlands, you have several companies that actually hire people with autism for this particular reason. They are excellent in doing manual regression testing, for example. And the fun thing is that in this team, initially, this guy was considered to be a problem, a person that you do not like to work with. But the fun thing is that for companies that only hire these people, they are actually part of the solution. You don't come in if you don't have a form of autism. So they do not consider it to be a problem. No, having autism is what they offer. It's part of their solution. So this is my third example. Now, if you want to do this, because I've been now through, okay, problems do not exist, there are a free way of dealing with the problems, and you can, once you accept this, you can kind of use your problem as part of your solution. Now, if you want to do this yourself, there are a few steps that you can go through. The first fact, and I often say, if you run into a problem, sleep a night over it. Try not to respond immediately. Don't respond out of emotion. We've all done that at least one time. If somebody comes up to you and say, hey, for the 5th time in a row, we're going to deliver our software too late, I can imagine that you get a little emotional. But I suggest sleep a night over it and try to look at what is really fact and what is perception. Remember the toilet? Think of what is fact, what is perception here. Try to take that helicopter view as well. Okay, it's my problem, but is it also a problem for the people that are, that I'm working with? Is it a problem for our project manager? Is it a problem for our testers? Is it a problem for, analysts, end users, etc., etc.? It's really important that you do this. Again, think of the toilet. Now, if you do this, you can turn a fact into a possibility. And later on, I'll show you 4 categories and kind of describe a few ways of how you can go through that thought process. But first, I would like to introduce you to my, hold on, to a situation where I think this turning a fact into a possibility has been used incredibly awesome. Let me take a sip of water. In the Netherlands, there was a television show of a guy called Paul the Leeuw, and he had a late night show on Saturday evening. Millions of people watched that show, and he was once doing his show on a Saturday evening live, and a streaker ran into his show. You know what a streaker is, kind of naked guy. And this guy, he was called the vegan streaker. He was a known streaker in the Netherlands. So he had written over his body, like meat is murder and leave animals alone, that kind of stuff. He had written it all over his face, but he wasn't really naked. He was still wearing his, underwear, his boxer short, for example. And he ran into the show, and immediately what you saw was, security jumping at him and say, hey, let's get him out as soon as possible. But Paul, the presenter of the show, said, no, leave him alone. Leave him alone. Hold on. I want to talk to him. But the fun thing was, he was actually on the telephone at that moment. So what he said to the streaker was, hey, hold on a second. I'll get back. I'll get to you. But just let me finish my call. So he called for another 2 minutes, and this streaker was standing there like, okay, I kind of not really expected this to happen. What should I do now? But he waited. And then after 2 minutes, Paul said, okay, I'll finish my call. Come over here. Go sit on my lap and tell me what happened. Tell me, why are you here? What do you want to tell us? And, you know, the streaker, he totally lost his words because he didn't really prepare. He didn't really expect this to happen. So he started, you know, talking a little about, okay, this is what I want to share to you, blah, blah, blah. And then Paul said, well, but, you know, so you're the vegan streaker, but explain one thing to me. Streakers, I don't know what your, you know, view of a streaker is, but where I come from, streakers are naked. You're not naked. And what happened then was, you know, he kind of ripped his underwear off. This guy stood there naked and ran out of the studio. He ran out. And the cool thing is that a lot of people in the Netherlands can still remember that single night where this happened, can still remember the vegan streaker and him running out naked. While the rest of the show, you know, everybody's forgotten about that. And this, you know, this example is a great example of where somebody turned a problem, a vegan streaker running into your show, into a great possibility, a possibility that now a lot of people still remember. Now, I intentionally did not really provide it with you with a video of this show, because it could be offensive for some people, but I'd like to show you some pictures of what happened back then. It was, you know, it was hilarious. Anyway, if you want to be like Paul yourself, again, I said I bought a book on this, and it described 4 strategies that you can use to turn a problem into, you know, a solution, and to incorporate a problem into your solution. I cannot go through these 4 categories and the total of, I think, 15 to 16 ways that you can transform a problem into a solution and incorporate it. But I will name out 2. One in the game category and one in the conflict category. The game category, what I really liked was an example of a young boy that was bullied in school. Because what they did every time is they would take little pennies, you know, small amounts of money, and they would throw it in front of him on the floor. And what this guy would do was that he would pick up the penny and, you know, put it in his pocket, because this way he could earn a little money. But every time he did that, people were laughing at him and made fun of him and give him names. So, you know, he really, you know, when people got to know that when you throw a penny at this guy, he would pick it up and stick it in his pocket, and, you know, he would literally crawl over the floor to get it. More and more people started doing this, and you really, you know, he got picked on by the entire school. Everybody knew it, and this was sad for this kid, because everybody was bullying him this way. And one time, a teacher came up to this boy and said, "Do you realize that if you stop picking up these pennies, you will, you know, they will stop bullying you. You know, if you stop doing this, stop showing this behavior for like a week, people will not bully you anymore." And he said, "Well, yeah, but I want to buy a new computer, and I need to save some money for that, and this is my way of earning that computer." So this guy didn't really consider it to be a problem. No, getting bullied was actually part of the way he tried to finance his computer. And I thought it was really, you know, a different way of looking at that situation. Well, actually, this came from the conflict category. I have another one that is from the game category. Dutch postmen, people delivering mail door to door, they were once working in a very hot summer, and the problem was they were not allowed to wear I should call it shorts, summer wear shorts. They had to wear traditional trousers, so until their ankles, until their feet, and these people were dying of heat, and at a certain point people started to revolt, and their management sent out a letter to everybody: hey, you're not allowed to wear shorts, this is not allowed in this company, that's not our policy, we don't like it. And then a few people said, okay, we'll start wearing skirts, and they started wearing skirts. So is not being allowed to wear shorts a problem? No, if you want to do this, if that is intended, we will, we'll go outside of the regular boundaries with our way of thinking. We'll start wearing skirts. So it was intended that they were not allowed to wear shorts, and so they start wearing skirts. Same thing. Well, again, I cannot go through all these categories and all the way of rethinking. Well, if you want to know more about it, it's actually in a book called Yes, But What If Everything Works Out? You can, drop me a Twitter message and I can send you an Amazon link, or you can go to Amazon and try to find it yourself. But the name of the book is Yes, But What If Everything Works Out? Now, I've been through this presentation. I've told you a few things. First of all, problems do not exist, but perceptions do. Again, think of the toilet. And what I've also told you was there are three ways of dealing with a problem. One is traditionally one that testers use, but that's not a wrong thing. But in some situations, it's more efficient to use one of the other two. I showed you some examples on how to incorporate a problem into a solution in a way that is actually intended that your problem will occur. And I will show you some ways of how you can do this as well. Now, I'd like to finish this webinar by challenging you to treat the problems that you run into in your day-to-day job in a way that I described. Not always, try to be flexible and try to make your problems part of your solution, because I think it's fun and it will make your life easier as a tester, but also your day-to-day life. So I'd like to finish here, hand over presentation once again.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Bart. And we'll now open the floor to your questions. So if you have any questions for Bart and you haven't already typed them, you can do so now. And while you're typing your questions, let me just bring your attention to the EuroSTAR archive, webinar archive. And here you can view a recording of this webinar, as well as 80 other webinars on a wide selection of testing topics. And finally, the call for submissions to speak at the 2014 EuroSTAR conference in Dublin is now open. The theme of next year's conference is Diversity, Innovation, Leadership, as chosen by Programme Chair 2014, Paul Gerard. The deadline for submission is February 14th, and for more information on how to submit, please visit the EuroSTAR website. Let us now take a look at your questions. So the first question I have for you, Bart, is, in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned your situation as a test coordinator. In this particular case, the developers in your team didn't deliver on time, and somehow you couldn't change that. How would you solve that now?
It's a tough one, because I actually got a similar question as well, actually during the EuroSTAR conference. I didn't really came up to a point where I could, come up with a total solution. But I think, the three ways of dealing with a problem are already, important here. to take into consideration. A lot of times what we do, if we repeatedly run into the same problems, we're kind of surprised that it's still, it happens again. Hey, they're delivering late again and again, and somehow we're still surprised. I think that is typically yeah, but attitude. Not being in control, not being fully in control. It's a little reactive, and I challenge people to, for once, take one of the other two categories. For example, if you use a yes but attitude in that situation, and they're still delivering late, just accept it, and but again, fully accept it. Try to test as much as possible that you have in the time left, and hope for it to go wrong seriously one time in production. And then you will definitely get attention, or people will ask you, okay, well, what happened? And you will say, hey, testers do not really get a lot of time to do some testing. People are always delivering late. We do not have all the time we need to do our work. What do you expect to happen? Or perhaps you could use the other category, the no because. And in that case, you simply say, no, I do not accept this anymore. People should deliver on time, and I, as a task coordinator, task manager, do simply not accept this to happen. And I will not accept it. And those two ways of dealing with it is already completely different from what we now do a lot of times, which is that yes, but way of thinking. Oh, they're delivered again on time. Oh, it's such a disaster. Now let's see what we can still do in the time left. Oh, we're so surprised, whatever. So in that particular case, I challenge people to do one of the other two categories. And again, I did not really thought of a way where people could, really turn this as part of their solution, besides going agile, for example, because in those situations, you're one team, and you do not have separate developers, separate testers anymore. You're one team, so they cannot simply deliver too late, because that would imply you delivering too late as well. So I hope that is an answer to your question.
The next question I have here says, from your experience, is it hard to change the way of thinking for every team member in your team?
Oh yeah. I bought this book a few years ago, and I still, looking at myself, I still find it hard to sometimes, not to get emotional when I run into a problem, and not react primarily. I don't know if that is the correct word, but instant reaction that comes from emotion, and I sometimes forget to take a little distance and to rethink it and to see, okay, what is fact, what is problem, how can I really use this, how can I make this part of my solution, and yeah, so for me it's hard, but people I work with and people I tell about this way of thinking, yeah, of course they run into the same things, because sometimes it's just the way you deal with your problems from emotion and instantly. So yeah, this way of thinking, it's not easy. Of course, it depends on your personality, on your role, the situation you're in, but it's definitely not easy. And I hope that is an answer to the question.
The next question I have here says, what is the role of context in viewing a problem, and does it change the meaning and nature of the facts?
This is all about, I think, context. The situation that I described was a way where I kind of walked into my problems as I sort of traditionally use the method, I use methodologies to solve my problem. And sometimes, in some situations, those can help you and those can guide you. But I found out that it wouldn't help. So in those particular situations, you really had to look at, okay, what is happening? What is the context here? And how am I going to solve this? So in that particular case, context, a specific situation at a specific client happening in a, specific time set with specific people, that was, it was all about context. And that's also the reason why I tell people I cannot come up with a solution for your problems in every situation, because every situation is different. Each time the context is different. And I hope that was an answer to the question.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time there, so I just want to wrap things up, and I want to say thank you very much to Bart for doing today's webinar, and I'd also like to thank all of the attendees for attending and your questions. The webinar is now over. Thank you very much, and goodbye.